Have you ever been in a situation where the facts and reality of your need seem to be in contradiction to the things you're believing God for? You know what I'm talking about. The times when you're tithing, but your finances don't seem to reflect it. Or times when you're believing God's promises for your kids, but man, you're watching and their lives seem to be unraveling at the seams. Or other times where you're believing God for healing, but the doctor's reports, they just seem to be getting worse and worse. You know, living between the tension of fact and faith, that can be difficult. But help is on the way. This past week, our Power of Three reading brought us to a passage of a man that had to learn to navigate the tension between those two. His name was Jairus, and his story is recorded in Mark chapter 5, verse 35 through 43. Let's read it together. While Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" But ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John. And when they came to the house of the synagogue ruler, he saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. Jesus went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha, come," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. And Jesus gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Now imagine the story. Jesus is in transit to heal this man's daughter, and while he's on the way, they stop him and say, "Forget it, it's too late. She's already died." How does Jesus respond? The Bible says he ignored them. Now listen to how the Bible states this fact. It says, ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Today we're going to discuss how to live between the tension of hardcore facts and faith. We're going to talk about how to do that in a moment, but before we do, let me highlight some skills that we're going to need to navigate these areas. The first thing that we have to do is we need discerning faith. The most important thing to start out is to check our motives and our intentions. You know, it's easy in these times to confuse our will with God's will. You and I are totally incapable of comprehending the capacity of God's will. The Lord had to remind Isaiah of this in Isaiah 55, verse 8 and 9. And this is what he said, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." So there is a fine line between acting in faith and reckless foolishness. We're going to talk today about how to navigate that tension. The second thing we need to do when our faith conflicts with facts is we need to make sure that we have an environment of faith. Now, you'll notice that Jesus had to make a decision on what to ignore. There were things in that environment that he wanted to take in, and there were things in that environment that he didn't want to take in. Well, what did he ignore? Jesus ignored words, thoughts, and environments of unbelief. Now, let's talk about the words first. You'll notice that when people came and said things that were factual, things that were accurate, the girl died, it was obvious, that wasn't a lie, but still there were words that Jesus didn't want to take in, and he decided to ignore them. He told Jairus that his greatest obstacle wasn't his daughter's death, but his own unbelief. Jesus also decided to put himself in an environment of faith. When he walked into the house, there were people that were projecting fear and drama, and Jesus cleared the house and only let a certain amount of people go in with them. The Bible says this, "He did not let anyone follow him in except Peter, James, and John." You know, you and I need to be very selective of who we let in to our house of need when we're in need of a miracle in our own life. Our faith will never rise above the lowest common denominator of our inner circle. We've talked about two things. Let's talk about the third, and that is that we need acts of faith. The last thing that Jesus did was he acted in faith. He said the solution wasn't as complicated as fear made it seem to be. He told Jairus, he said this, he said, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Just believe. Man, don't you wish it was that easy? I mean, that is so much easier said than done. What do those words, just believe, mean? Sometimes people say just believe or just trust. Well, maybe just meant simple. In other words, Jesus was saying to Jairus, Jairus, this isn't as hard as you think. This is simpler than you could imagine. Instead of focusing on what you can't believe, focus upon what you can. But that word just believe also could have meant just in terms of exclusive. In other words, there's just one thing you need to do, Jairus, and that is to have faith. Perhaps the phrase just believe meant precisely. In other words, Jesus might have been saying to Jairus, Jairus, this is exactly what you've got to do, just like this. Or it's even possible that the phrase just believe meant a narrow margin. In other words, Jesus might have been saying to Jairus, Jairus, fear may just make you miss this miracle. I personally believe that the phrase means all of those things. So what I want us to do now in the next couple minutes is to put this passage on a crash course collision with needs in our own lives. Let's navigate this tension together and talk about how it applies to our faith and how we have to confront and navigate times when faith and facts don't jive and we, like Jairus, have to learn to dream again.